Somewhere in America, right now, there is a 1971 Plymouth sitting in someone's backyard, maybe behind a barn, maybe under a tarp in a garage that hasn't been opened in 20 years. The owner, or the owner's son, or the owner's grandkid who inherited it, has no idea what they have. They think it's just an old Mopar. Here's what it actually is. It's one of 55 cars built in the final year of the 426 Street Hemi, one of the rarest factory muscle car configurations ever to leave the Chrysler Corporation. A car that someone bought new in 1971 for around $4,000. And that Mecum Indy in 2023, one of these cars, unrestored, numbers matching, 10,828 original miles, crossed the auction block at $500,000. The person who bought it new made a $496,000 profit. They didn't do anything special, they just kept the car. And they didn't know, when they bought it, that anyone would ever care. This is the story of the 1971 Plymouth Hemi Road Runner, the muscle car nobody wanted when it was new, that nobody realized was valuable for decades, and that is now one of the most extraordinary collector stories in American automotive history. The Road Runner's origins. Budget Bruiser philosophy. To understand why the 1971 Hemi Road Runner became what it became, you have to start at the beginning, 1968, and understand the specific problem Plymouth was trying to solve. By the mid-1960s, the muscle car formula that Pontiac had pioneered with the GTO was beginning to betray its own original purpose. Cars that had started as affordable performance machines were creeping upmarket. Options lists were getting longer. Luxury features were appearing where there hadn't been any. Plymouth themselves had the GTX, explicitly marketed as the gentleman's muscle car, which came with every premium option the factory offered and priced accordingly. Somebody at Plymouth looked at this trend and recognized that it had moved the goalposts. The whole point of the original muscle car concept was that a working-class buyer could get supercar performance at a price that didn't require a second mortgage. The GTX, for all its excellence, wasn't that car anymore. The Road Runner, launched for 1968, was Plymouth's course correction. The concept was brutal in its simplicity. Strip everything that wasn't necessary for performance. Back seats, optional deletion. Carpet, optional deletion. Radio? Same. You could literally order a Road Runner with rubber floor mats and a bench seat, and no entertainment of any kind, because all of that was weight you didn't need. The car came with a 383 cubic inch V8 as standard equipment. A genuine big block, at a base price below $3,000. The optional 426 Street Hemi brought the price up, but the philosophy was the same. Maximum performance, minimum everything else. The name itself came from the Warner Brothers cartoon character, and Plymouth negotiated the rights, including the beep-beep horn that the car actually had as standard equipment. This was marketing that understood its audience. Young buyers weren't interested in being sold a gentleman's anything. They wanted a car named after a cartoon bird that made a funny noise and went fast. The Road Runner was an immediate, massive commercial success. In its first full model year, Plymouth sold 44,599 of them. By 1969, that number had climbed to 84,420, an all-time production high that the nameplate would never approach again. And then the world changed. The 1971 B-body, beautiful at the worst possible moment. By 1971, the forces that were about to end the muscle car era were already in full effect. Insurance premiums on high-performance vehicles have been climbing for years. Emissions regulations were tightening in ways that threatened the mechanical foundations of big block V8s. The buying public's relationship with powerful cars was shifting. And into this environment, Chrysler introduced the most dramatically styled B-body Mopars the company had ever built. The 1971 Dodge Charger and Plymouth Road Runner received a complete redesign that replaced the famous Coke bottle styling of the second-generation cars with what Chrysler called the fuselage body style. The reference was deliberate. These cars were meant to look like fighter jets. Long hood, short deck lid, raked windshield, a flowing body that suggested speed even sitting still. The Road Runner and Charger had distinct sheet metal. They weren't just badge engineering exercises. and each looked genuinely different from the other while sharing the same dramatic design language. To modern eyes, this generation of Mopar muscle is stunning. The 1971 Road Runner in particular has an aggressive, almost threatening presence that holds up better than almost anything else built during the Golden Age. Car enthusiasts who discover these cars today often react with genuine disbelief that they've never seen one before. But in 1971, buyers weren't buying them. Road Runner production fell from that 1969 peak of 84,420 units all the way down to 14,218 in 1971. A drop of more than 83% in 2 years. Buyers who had loved the second-generation Charger's Coke bottle styling weren't warming up to the new fuselage look. The market was contracting. The insurance and emissions issues were biting. And most crucially, 1971 was the last year for both the 426 Street Hemi and the 446-barrel engine. The two most celebrated performance engines in Mopar's history were about to disappear, which meant that of the 14,218 Road Runners built in 1971, a very specific subset was about to become historically unique, the ones carrying the 426 Street Hemi. There were 55 of them. 55. That's the entire production run of the car that just sold for $500,000. And in 1971, nobody wanted them. The 426 Street Hemi, America's greatest engine. Before we talk about what happened to these cars in the collector market, we need to spend a moment on the engine that made them significant. Because the 426 Street Hemi deserves its reputation, and understanding that reputation explains why rarity in this specific configuration matters so much. The 426 cubic inch Hemi V8 was, in its era, the single most powerful production engine available in any American car. The hemispherical combustion chamber design, which gives the engine its name, allowed for dramatically better airflow than the conventional wedgehead V8s that dominated the industry. More airflow meant more oxygen. More oxygen meant more combustion. More combustion meant more power. Official factory rating: 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. These numbers were widely understood at the time, and have since been confirmed by independent testing to be conservative estimates. The actual output of a well-tuned Street Hemi was meaningfully higher than the factory admitted, a common practice during this period when insurance companies were watching horsepower ratings closely, and manufacturers had every incentive to understate their engine's capabilities. On the drag strip, a Hemi-equipped Road Runner could run the quarter mile in the low 13-second range. At a time when 14-second quarter miles were considered genuinely fast for a street-legal car, the Hemi Road Runner was in a different category entirely. Between 1966 and 1971, the total production of 426 Street Hemi-equipped cars across all Mopar nameplates was fewer than 10,000 units. That sounds like it should be an enormous number, until you consider that these cars were being produced during what was arguably the most competitive and commercially active period in American muscle car history, when tens of thousands of comparable cars from Chevrolet, Ford, and Pontiac were being sold every year. Of those fewer than 10,000 total Hemi cars, the Road Runner received the largest allocation of any single nameplate. The Plymouth carried the Hemi in larger numbers than any other Mopar model, a fact that speaks to how seriously Plymouth and Chrysler took the stripped-down performance philosophy the car represented. The Hemi wasn't dressed up in the Road Runner. It was just there to be fast. In 1968 alone, more than 1,000 Road Runners left the factory with the 426 Street Hemi. Across the nameplate's entire Hemi production run, 2,014 Road Runners were built with this engine. The 1971 cars, all 55 of them, represent the final chapter of that story. The $500,000 auction, the car that shocked everyone. Here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. At Mecum Indy 2023, a 1971 Plymouth Hemi Road Runner crossed the auction block. And the details of this specific car are what made it something special, even within the tiny universe of surviving 1971 Hemi Road Runners. Triple black, black exterior, black interior, black top, an unrestored, numbers-matching example, meaning the engine, transmission, and major components are all original to the car as it left the factory, documented and verified. A 4-speed manual transmission, because this was the configuration serious drivers ordered, and 10,828 miles on the odometer. Original miles. This car had been driven fewer than 11,000 miles in over 50 years. It was a one-owner car. Someone had bought it new in 1971, paid approximately $4,000 for it, and then, apparently, largely stopped driving it, kept it, preserved it, perhaps without fully understanding what they had. The hammer dropped at $500,000. The profit on that transaction, purchase price versus sale price, was approximately $496,000 on a car that nobody in 1971 was particularly excited to buy. To put that in perspective, the original buyer paid roughly the equivalent of what a moderately equipped new car costs today, and the return, over 53 years, made this a better investment than almost any conventional financial instrument you could have put that money into instead. Of course, nobody in 1971 was thinking about this car as an investment. That's the entire point of this story. The muscle cars of the golden age were consumer products, transportation with attitude, not financial instruments with Hemi engines. The people who bought them new weren't preserving them for posterity. They were buying speed. The ones who happened to keep their cars, for whatever reason, garage space, sentimentality, just never getting around to selling, turned out to have made one of the most extraordinary inadvertent financial decisions in the history of American consumer goods. The 1971 B-body market. Why the overlooked generation rules. The 1971 Plymouth Hemi Road Runner's auction result wasn't an isolated event. It was the most dramatic example of a broader pattern that has emerged in the classic Mopar market over the past decade. The conventional wisdom about B-body Mopar collectability had always been straightforward. 1968 through 1970 is the golden period. The second-generation Charger, with its famous Coke bottle curves and flying buttress roofline, is one of the most visually iconic cars in American automotive history. It appeared in The Dukes of Hazzard, countless films, and more magazine covers than any other Mopar of the era. The 1969 Charger Daytona with its towering rear wing. The 1969 Charger 500. These were the cars that defined the category, the 1971 generation. For decades, collectors treated these as the consolation prize. The cars nobody particularly wanted, carrying a styling language that took years to appreciate. When you could buy a pristine 1969 Charger for a meaningful amount, why would you look at a 1971? But the auction records over the past several years have completely inverted that logic. The 1971 Dodge Charger Hemi RT in Hemi Orange, sold in 2023, crossed the block at $550,000. That made it the most expensive non-aero car hardtop muscle car ever sold at public auction. Not a Charger Daytona. Not a 1969 Charger 500. A car from the generation everyone had written off. The most a 1971 Hemi GTX has sold for. The car that was actually positioned above the Road Runner in Plymouth's lineup, with more luxury features and more prestige positioning, is $374,000. Which means the stripped-down budget muscle car outvalued the premium luxury performance car by $126,000. The hierarchy that existed on the showroom floor in 1971 has been completely reversed by 50 years of collector market dynamics. For comparison, the most expensive second-generation Hemi Charger RT we could find sold for $352,000. A 1969 Charger 500 peaked at $231,000. The cars that dominated the collector market conversation for decades are being outpriced by the generation everyone ignored. Why? Scarcity is the obvious answer, but it's more specific than that. The 1971 B-bodies weren't popular when they were new, which meant fewer were preserved with any intention. The ones that survived did so by accident, hidden in garages and barns by owners who had no idea they were sitting on something historically significant. That accidental preservation, combined with genuine mechanical rarity in the Hemi examples, creates the exact conditions that drive major auction results. The Holy Grail, the 1972 446 barrel. And now we get to the chapter of this story that makes even the 1971 Hemi Road Runner look like a common find. The 446 barrel, called the six-pack at Dodge and the 446 barrel at Plymouth, was the other legendary high-performance engine option in 1971. Three two-barrel carburetors beating a 440 cubic inch big block, producing 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. Nearly Hemi-equivalent performance at a significantly lower price. The configuration was beloved by drag racers who appreciated the tuning flexibility of 3 carbs versus 2 4-barrels. Like the 426 Hemi, the 446 barrel was officially discontinued after the 1971 model year. Except that someone at Plymouth apparently didn't get the memo. The 446 barrel appeared as an option in some early 1972 Plymouth catalogs, a production mistake, a leftover piece of copy from 1971 that hadn't been updated. And in the confusion between what was printed and what was actually supposed to be available, somewhere between 2 and 3 1972 Plymouth Road Runners actually left the factory with the 446 barrel engine. These cars weren't supposed to exist. They were a production error, a documentation oversight that slipped through the system before anyone caught it. The whereabouts of at least one confirmed 1972 4406 barrel Road Runner is known to serious Plymouth historians. If that car ever comes to auction, in whatever condition it's in, the bidding will be extraordinary. Collectors who specialize in rare Mopar configurations would recognize immediately what they were looking at. A car produced in the single digits, carrying an engine that officially no longer existed, in a year when it should have been impossible to order. That car could, legitimately, challenge the $500,000 Road Runner record. Some Mopar specialists think it could exceed it.
Section 7. The market today. What survivors are worth. Let's talk about what the 1971 Hemi Road Runner market looks like right now, because the data is genuinely striking. J.D. Power's high retail price for a 1971 Plymouth Road Runner Hemi comes in at $211,700. Haggerty's concourse condition valuation sits at $285,000. Those are the benchmark prices for excellent, well-documented examples in good condition, not the extraordinary outlier that sold for $500,000, but the baseline expectation for serious collector-quality cars. For context on what that means in terms of appreciation, these cars were not considered significant collector items as recently as the 1990s. A 1971 Road Runner in good shape could be purchased for under $20,000 in many parts of the country. The transition from overlooked to invaluable happened faster, and more dramatically, than almost any other segment of the classic car market. Only 3 1971 Hemi Road Runners have appeared at major public auction in recent memory. The $500,000 record setter in 2023, a $242,000 sale in 2025, and a $176,000 result back in 2019. That's it. 3 known public auction sales from a total production of 55 cars. The rest of those 55 cars are somewhere. Some have been lost, crashed, worn out, scrapped. Some are in private collections that will never come to market. And some, the genuinely exciting possibility, are sitting in garages and barns and storage facilities, owned by people who have no idea what they have. The original article that inspired this video puts it perfectly. Somewhere, somebody has a highly optioned 1971 B-body Mopar, rusting away in a backyard, with no idea how valuable it is. When that car eventually surfaces, and given the rarity, it's when, not if, it may set a new record entirely. The 1971 Plymouth Hemi Road Runner is the muscle car that nobody wanted, that nobody realized was valuable, that turned a $4,000 purchase into a $500,000 windfall for a buyer who simply kept what they had. 55 cars. 1 year. The last gasp of the 426 Street Hemi, wrapped in the most dramatic Mopar body style ever built, sold to buyers who mostly didn't want them and couldn't have imagined what they'd become. The 1971 Plymouth Hemi Road Runner is the most compelling argument I know for the idea that value and recognition don't always arrive at the same time. For 50 years, these cars sat in the shadow of the generation before them, dismissed as lesser versions of the cars everyone actually wanted. Then one of them sold for $500,000, and everything changed. Now I want to hear from you. Did you know about the 1971 Hemi Road Runner before today? And if you found one of these sitting in a barn, what would you do with it? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. If you learned something new today, hit the like button and subscribe for American automotive history that most channels never bother to tell. See you next time.